Zara, thank you very much indeed for the invitation to be here. It's an enormous pleasure. It's also a little daunting for me because I'm in the presence of distinguished experts on warfare, and I'm not among them. I'm a museum curator by training and experience, but I spent 3 months helping Zara work through Persian metalwork in the Ashmolean Museum when I was based there. And she invited me to contribute to this workshop around the way in which we display as museum curators ideas of warfare or not. So in a way, I'm coming to this from the opposite end of the academic spectrum, as it were, and thinking about how do we tell these extraordinary stories to the general public through material culture in museums. So I initially told Zara I would call my talk Displaying War and Peace in the Ashmolean, but then after a little bit more thought and development, I thought a better title. So Displaying War and Peace in Oxford. For those of you who know the university, that might have multiple connotations, but actually I wanted to think about, again, that whole question of what museums do and can help our understanding around this question of what is warfare and how do we present it more widely. So I will start not at the Ashmolean, as I originally thought, but actually at our sister institution in Oxford, which is the Pitt Rivers Museum, and thinking really around how the collections were established and how important warfare plays in the formation of that museum and what it's about. So this is Augustus Henry Lane Fox. He was born in 1827, but he was a military man by training. Again, warfare fundamental in his makeup. In 1841, he entered the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst and was commissioned into the Grenadier Guards in 1845. He fought for a short time in the Crimean War and then served in Malta, England, Canada, and Ireland. He retired in 1882 at the age of 55 with the honorary rank of Lieutenant General. In 1880, he unexpectedly inherited a large country estate, and with it came the name of Pitt Rivers from his great uncle. The country estate was a substantial one, and this meant that Pitt Rivers received a large annual income for the remainder of his life. He was therefore a wealthy landowner. He died in 1900 at the age of 73. Now, Pitt Rivers became passionate about collecting archaeological and ethnographic objects. He obtained objects while he was on active service, and later in life collected objects during working trips and holidays abroad. But the vast majority of objects came from dealers, auction houses, and fellow members of the Anthropological Institute. The general gave his collection to the University of Oxford on condition that they built a museum to house it, appoint a lecturer to teach it, and maintain the general mode of display. The museum opened to visitors in 1887 and was fully opened by 1892. And you see a recent picture of the Pitt Rivers Museum. Although the displays have been rearranged, the general mode, as the general asked, is retained to this day. Now, the museum can be said to have begun as a small collection of weapons. Pitt Rivers' initial interest was in the development of firearms during the 1850s, and this grew into a fascination with weaponry from all other cultures, particularly of societies past and present, whose material culture seemed to suggest the beginnings of human society. As his interest in the origin of weapons grew, he began acquiring implements, many of which could have been used as weapons or tools. And although his studies broadened to encompass a whole range of material arts and industries, tools and weapons continue to dominate the Pitt Rivers collection, making up about 50% of the objects he donated to Oxford. It was also the result of broader academic perception of that time of what a savage society was. And these were described, of course, as sort of bellicose, primitive, and also very collectible. A perception that fueled the earliest years of professional anthropology. In the context of the late Victorian obsession with human progress and origin, weapons and stone tools encapsulated everything that a good savage was supposed to be. And Pitt Rivers' own military career and his early interest in collecting weapons, coupled with the impact of evolutionary theory had on his own thinking during the 1860s, led him to a conclusion that belligerence was a basic human impulse. And furthermore, it was the impulse that underpinned the origin of all cultural life. Pitt Rivers traced the origins of warring back to the animal kingdom, arguing that primitive man had learnt lessons from nature's solutions to the problems of defensive and offensive weapons, so that the origin of human armor could be traced to animal hides, scales, and shells, and the origins of spears and piercing weapons was found in the horns of the rhinoceros, boar, and walrus. It's perhaps therefore no coincidence that the Pitt Rivers Museum leads directly from the Oxford University Museum of Natural History. And here in these images, you see the Oxford University Museum, which opened in 1860. And then at the back, as many of you I'm sure will know, is the door that leads into the Pitt Rivers Museum. Now, the social and moral implications of this philosophy resound in the names that were used during the 19th century for societies without a government infrastructure: barbarous, savage, brute, and so on. These so-called simple societies were deemed to be the most primitive and therefore the most warlike. The artifacts of war provided the perfect data for studying the gradual evolution of human culture, from the most simple to the most complex. The technology of war linked and yet distinguished all human beings throughout the world. If Pitt Rivers could demonstrate the thousands of tiny manifestations that had accrued in human arts and industries since the dawn of human culture, he could simultaneously uphold the evolutionist claim that humans were animals too, by showing unbroken continuity of cultural progress, and provide some reassurance that his own cultural experience was at the furthest extreme from the original animal state that so fascinated him. The need for technologies of war might be universal, but the differences between a roughly formed stone implement and the complicated mechanics of a single-shot rifle were plain to see. Weapons were therefore arranged according to type. Parallels and juxtapositions were shown in the museum to reveal the great diversities of ways to solve similar problems in different times by different peoples. And despite the fact that Pitt Rivers had acquired all sorts of artifacts, he became known by his collection of weapons. The museum was often referred to as a museum of weapons. Now, the sorts of arrangements of displays then became picked up by other museums, both in the United Kingdom, but also more broadly, and continue to impact the way in which weapons, warfare is discussed and displayed in museums to this day. So, to give you a couple of examples, here is the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds with this quite spectacular arrangement of weapons, but very much, in a sense, modelled on that early approach to grouping collections of weaponry in one place for impact. the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, just to pluck another example, again, a collection of weapons brought together without any real context. The image is there to impress variety and form rather than actual use and history. Now, those forms of display are also very common for ancient materials in museums. And here I bring into the equation what actually brought me here through Zara, her focus and interest on the Luristan Bronzes of Western Iran dating to the first millennium BC, and very typical displays of this extraordinary material here in the Louvre and in my own institution now, the British Museum, is really about gathering them together. But again, it's about variety and form without necessarily any context or history. So that then brings me to the Ashmolean, the sister institution very much to the Pitt Rivers, about 10 minutes walk from the Pitt Rivers, and a very different institution. It opened in its current space 2 years after the Pitt Rivers opened, so in 1894. And although the Ashmolean Museum is a much older institution historically, it was founded in 1683, by the late 19th century, it was a shadow of its former self. And at that point, Arthur Evans, who you see here on the left of the slide, was appointed as its keeper, its director, effectively in 1884. And he decided to transform the Ashmolean, which had largely been natural history specimens and had been moved to the new University Museum, to turn the Ashmolean into a museum of archaeology. He had new galleries established next to the University Galleries, which was a collection of art, creating an institution of art and archaeology, which was combined formally when he retired in 1908. Now, the focus of the Ashmolean, as a result, was really on the civilizations of Europe. Of course, his excavations at Knossos on Crete were fundamental to this, but he also built and inherited a vast collection of archaeology covering other areas of Europe. By the end of the 19th century, this also included Egypt, which was brought into the narrative simply because it was understood as the roots of Western civilization. In many ways, it was everything the Pitt Rivers was not, including it was not a place for war. It was a place for civilization, and that meant Western civilization. And very ironically, it was actually warfare that created the archaeological material that I have recently been focused on as a curator, and that's the Middle Eastern material. It could be brought into this conversation of civilizations because, again, the Middle East was considered to be at the roots of Western civilization, but fundamentally it was conflict that enabled that conversation to take place. And again, I think the histories of museums and collecting are as important in thinking about warfare as much as, of course, our understanding of the actual material that's then presented within them. So here, for example, we see some of the characters deeply involved in the early 20th century in Oxford in thinking about the way in which the Ashmolean and the displays of that material should be progressed. David Hogarth, the keeper of the Ashmolean, who had succeeded Arthur Evans, and other individuals who would play a prominent role as Oxford alumni, but also, again, in terms of the coming World War. Gertrude Bell, T.E. Lawrence, famously Lawrence of Arabia, and Leonard Woolley. And of course, as a result of the British Empire's invasion of Palestine and Mesopotamia to confront the Ottoman Empire, we open up an opportunities for archaeologists and museum collectors to engage with the material culture of this part of the world. Objects were arriving in Oxford during the conflict itself, during the First World War. Here, for example, this little Sumerian statue dating from the mid-3rd millennium BC actually came to the museum as a result of it having been dug up while trenches were being dug in 1917 by groups of Sikh soldiers, so from India, digging trenches in advance of conflict with Ottoman forces. Leading the army officer in the center of the photograph you see on the right of the slide, gave it to the Ashmolean in 1919. And then, of course, following the First World War, when Mesopotamia became part of British Mandate Authority and British control over the region, allowed huge excavations to be undertaken. Oxford joined, sorry, the slides are on automatic for some reason. Oxford joined with the Field Museum Chicago to dig a site called Kish, which produced thousands of objects exported to Oxford and to Chicago. Gertrude Bell here dividing the finds between the emerging kingdom of Iraq and Britain. And the focus was, of course, on civilization, which meant societies with writing. And again, this was the big focus for the material arriving in Oxford. Warfare itself, although a product of, as it were, this collecting practice, was not a feature of this collecting. The result was displays which were very typical right up until recent decades. Shelves and shelves of material culture, ceramics, metalwork, which showed variety and form, very much like the weapons in the Pitt Rivers Museum, but actually focusing on the products of urban civilized worlds, including, of course, long displays of writing. That was a tradition that actually continued very much up until the beginning of this century, and when the galleries in the Ashmolean were redisplayed with new techniques of presentation and lighting, but nonetheless, it remained very much a focus on, I would say, shelves of tablets, shelves of ceramics, typologies of material showing change through time and variety. So again, reflecting that very anthropological approach to material culture, not investing this material into a historical context to any great degree. That, of course, all really have been affected by recent conversations in the wider world. This is the impact it's had on museums, but again, thinking about how this has impacted scholarship more generally and the sorts of questions we were asking about the material culture of the past. So decolonizing museums has become, of course, a key conversation, which has meant we've, in museums at least, had to rethink some of the narratives and stories we focus on and how we tell them. And that, of course, also includes stories around conflict and warfare, modern warfare and conflict, and how that impacts our understanding and relationships with material from the past. I'm focusing here very much, of course, on my area of interest, the ancient Middle East, and the relationship of that with the present. And we've explored that at the Ashmolean through exhibitions, such as one called Owning the Past, where we looked at that relationship again between ancient Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, how material came to Oxford, but specifically through that lens of conflict. That involved, of course, talking to people, conversations with people from the region who had lived experience of both conflict, but also their relationship with their identities connected to this ancient material, and think about how that is bound together. And I think, again, this is it's crucial for museums to do this. And again, of course, wherever one's working with material culture around the world, there will be a legacy in the living communities. So we were faced with questions from people that challenged our reception and presentation of objects in the collections. A collection which had been focused very much on peace, on civilization, whatever that meant. And here we were faced by really quite challenging notions of course, acquisition of material, but also about all the trauma that comes out of these more recent periods. So owning the past became an immensely important learning curve for us in Oxford, but also as a temporary exhibition enabled us to think about our permanent displays. And again, the sorts of narratives that we should be telling in those. And what we need to be doing, and I think what we're seeing more widely now within the museum community, is recognizing what, I mean, in a way, we all do on a daily basis, whether it's on the bus or through academic dialogue, is storytelling through the material culture of the past. And that's really where our focus within museums, and of course, we've now got very exciting interpretive ways of doing that through sound, actually through smell, through projection, but also, of course, through words. So what did we do in the Ashmolean? So I use this as a case study just to, again, raise these questions around how we take the sorts of narratives that you're, as specialists of warfare, developing for past societies, around past societies, and think about how we might relay those in a public forum. Here's the layout of the old Middle East gallery, with its focus very much on writing and specific periods and the glories of civilization. We developed a new model where we focused on particular periods in time, so much more focused, where people could essentially, we hope, gain windows into those worlds. And that involves creating spaces, of course, which are inviting and interesting, and that can use exciting approaches to design, including color, the different colors, different landscapes of the region, but also, of course, the different narratives that are embedded within those landscapes. And we want to reveal the variety of those experiences where the material in the collection allows. So looking here, for example, we're in the 9th millennia BC through to the 6th millennia, where we focus on some of the village communities of Syria through the lens of the material in the Ashmolean. Excavated material, which allows us to open windows into the small village communities of that region. But of course, we are constrained to an extent by what archaeologists selected to return to the museum. So again, we're telling particular stories, and at this particular period, they are largely around social interactions at a village level. We don't, for example, see the sorts of evidence that we might hear about for conflict, for example. So it's about grinding stones, it's about daily life, it's about the pressures and tensions inherent in the village communities of that period. We wanted to also evoke the notion of a physical world, and one of the challenges, of course, for museums is that everything is generally behind glass. And again, thinking about everything we've heard so far today around that physical encounter within conflict, how do you get that across within a museum setting? Well, you can do that through interactives, where you offer opportunities for people to engage physically, even if they can't use the ancient object through attempts to evoke it. So here, for example, again, not conflict, not warfare in this particular case, but you have here a grinding stone from the 9th millennium BC, from this village community in Syria. We know from the skeletal evidence that women did most of the grinding and spent hours at a time grinding the seeds, the agricultural produce, damaging their backs, their feet and knees in the process. And to evoke something of that, we created a model where anybody at any age can have a go at pushing a grinding stone and model it, just to begin to imagine. So it's evoking imagination. And again, thinking about those questions of conflict and warfare, how we might be able to evoke that within a museum setting and make it a real experience without, of course, damaging the individual in the process. Sound is also an important way in which that, of course, can be evoked, and we can do that now very effectively in a museum context with arcs of sound, which means you can walk into and out of spaces within a gallery and actually get, again, a sense of experience and of life, of, in this case, it's, but of course, one might evoke conflict. But that's paralleled with written accounts as well as a video, and that Gilgamesh epic is about conflict between a hero and his enemy. So we begin to tease out some of the sensory nature of conflict within a museum setting. And that brings me to the Luristan Bronzes, of which there is an immense collection in the Ashmolean, teasing out some questions as much as anything within a museum setting. We can't tell everything, but we can connect those that extraordinary metalwork with, for example, the Assyrian reliefs. So we can see how they were used for horse strapping, but also as weaponry, through the ancient representations, but also through the labeling. We can begin to invite our visitors to think about the symbolism of many of these objects as much as their physical use as weapons. Again, the opportunities here to change the narrative are reflected in the way in which we've used magnetic labels, so that when we hope Zara does more analysis on this material culture, and we can see that they were perhaps used in a physical way, we can simply rewrite that narrative and allow our visitors to understand that effectively. At the moment, we focus on those rather gruesome looking axes at the top of the screen. They show no evidence as far as these are concerned for either being sharpened or use. So we presume they're symbolic, but there may be more to come. And I just wanted to really end by thinking about the potential way in which we can continually inflect the narratives within the museum displays in places like the Ashmolean, by rethinking those earlier focus on simply civilizations and peace, by really drawing on the sorts of evidence, of course, that you're investigating through your own work through warfare. So I just thought I would look at the site in North Syria called Tel Brak, simply because, having seen such exciting material from Europe so far in this workshop, I wanted to just think about some of the evidence that's beginning to emerge out of sites from the Middle East. And this is a particularly interesting site, which really has only become evident, well, the last 20 years effectively, because course, the last 10 years, Syria has been off limits because, sadly, of the civil war in the region. But prior to that, major excavations at Tel Brak produced some really interesting results. Here's a view of Tel Brak from around 2010, the last time I was sadly in Syria, looking at this vast settlement mound, which is the result of 5,000 years of continual rebuilding in mud brick. Here we have models of that great central mound, which you can see in the middle of these models in grey. That's the Tel, the settlement mound. But based on survey work, which was undertaken around that mound, you can see how it became evident based on the colour scheme here. We moved from small areas of settlement represented by that dark red colour, so small village communities, at the end of the 5th millennium BC into the 4th millennium BC, when Tel Brak grows substantially. So those village communities expand and coalesce with that central mound. This is the origins, effectively, of urbanization. And the question, of course, inevitably raised, what's causing that to happen? Warfare, inevitably, introduced very often as part of that equation. Excavations on the mound itself at Tel Brak reveals in the same period, late 5th, early 4th millennium, the focus on industrial productions at the heart of the settlement. And that includes focused on material brought in from outside the region. They're mainly tools, textile manufacturing, and more exotic resources. But alongside that industrial area, there's a monumental building, massive mud brick walls, beautifully made, some monumental architecture at the heart of the settlement. And in that monumental building, administration, impressions from stamp seals, which show perhaps the delivery of taxes into the center. It's one way of thinking about it. One of the earliest representations you see there on the right of the slide, an image of a man spearing a lion, which becomes the symbol of kingship in later Mesopotamian tradition. So maybe already here we've got hierarchies of power. There's also a simple, perhaps numerical administration, the sorts of recording systems which will, in 800 years' time, developed into some of the earliest writing, for example. And in the Ashmolean, there is a big collection of these objects that come from the site of Tel Brak. And at the moment, they're displayed in the Ashmolean to evoke the notion of an early city, because they're known as idols, but they're almost certainly not idols in the sense of gods, but representations of individual people who had left them in symbolic form as votives in a temple building. Thousands of these fragments, hundreds found at Tel Brak, which represents a population with an identity focused in one place. So this is about community, this is about large numbers of people. That, in more recent excavations, up to, let's say, 2010, on the outskirts of Tel Brak, and there you see indicated by the blue arrow, a raised mound at the edge of the settlement of Tel Brak, excavated, and what was revealed was layers and layers in this mound of bodies. Bodies that date in age between teenager and mid-age, 40s. So no very young, no elderly, both sexes, but mixed in with these bodies that are tipped in very unceremoniously into a great pile. This is not a pit. This is a pile in which then they are then covered by a mound. Mixed in with them are feasting vessels, ceramics, plates, and big stew pots. So banquets of some sort taking place during the internment of these bodies. They're not treated with great ceremony or apparent respect. Some of the skeletons have been treated, as in where the skulls have been modified or some of the bones modified. Many of the feet and hands bones are missing, suggesting that perhaps the bodies have been exposed for some time before being gathered up and interred into this mound. The current interpretation of this by the excavators is that this is the result of civil war. There's no other settlement close to Tel Brak in scale or complexity. So we don't think this is battles between equal forces, as it were, but an internal conflict in which these are either the losers and a mark in the landscape is created as a memory of that, or they belong to the winning party, and again, the monument is created for that purpose. But it raises, again, questions of urbanization, the stresses involved in early urbanization, and the large numbers of people that can, as a result of that, result in conflict, perhaps an early form of war. So just to conclude, we've put into the Ashmolean, into that gallery, a case which explores all those questions of relationships between the ancient past and the modern, but through, we hope, that flexible approach of magnetic labels and indeed magnetic mounts, we can start to introduce the sorts of narratives, such as that revealed by the excavations at Tel Brak, which hadn't been present to date. Thank you very much.